Hi, I'm Matthias, and this is the second part of our story of John Moses Browning. I won't bore you with much introduction, except to say I don't think you'll like this very much without watching part 1. And of course, to tell you that if you have a classic Browning firearm, the one truly safe way to protect it for decades to come is to clean and preserve it with our favorite do-all gun oil, Ballistol, best for both black powder and smokeless. Seriously, everyone should at least thank Ballistol for not making me prattle on for 90 seconds or lie about what it does or use key hooks for engagement. I just say what I already know, that it's great, and they help us keep bringing you this historical content. Now, let's talk about John Moses Browning. Last time we walked up from his birth until his development of a toggle-locked auto-loading shotgun. In May of 1899, he sold this to Winchester Repeating Arms with the proviso that there was no conflict between his patent and one by Hugo Borchardt, inventor of a toggle-locked auto-loading handgun. With Winchester technically on board with his shotgun for the US market, Browning wanted FN to handle the European market. However, it seems he waited too long to file patent over there. Engineer Georg Luger had been tasked with improving the C93, and in doing so had hit on the same idea as John Moses. The original Borchardt had unnecessary length, as there had to be an extension off the rear knuckle that could be directed to teeter-totter the toggle link from locked to unlocked. Both Browning and Luger would choose to use a ramp that would meet the central axis on recoil. Now, we have a whole episode on how the Luger came to be, but in this instance we're talking about Browning. His invention predated the Luger, and his patent beat him out in the US as well. Unaware of the much earlier and publicly witnessed prototypes, Luger moved to dispute the claims. During the winter of 1899 and 1900, Luger wrote the Browning's attorney accusing them of stealing the concept through a third-party information leak. Hans Tascher, who at this point in time was a sales agent for DWM, one that had both visited the Brownings directly in Ogden and traveled alongside John Moses for one of his transatlantic trips. By the end of this dispute, both sides would blame Tascher for being the leak, each accusing the other of theft. Fun fact for those trying to decide who to believe in this case, Tascher went on to be a spy and saboteur during the Great War. Georg Luger was also accused of patenting stolen ideas by none other than Paul Mauser. While it isn't proof, it is a smoke signal. Despite his bluster, Luger seems to have known that Browning had him beat, because his initial play was to threaten Browning's European sales of his toggle shotgun unless he made way for Luger's pistol in the US. This would have been sort of a let's call it even. Unfortunately for Luger, instead of just offering this gentlemanly trade, he demanded that Browning sign a concession of priority of invention to Georg Luger. Yeah, that didn't go over so well, and Team Browning said, "Sue me." So Luger did. He filed an infringement case with the US Patent Office in May of 1900. This was almost immediately rebuffed. They asked for hard proof that Browning was not the actual inventor of this concept. From here, Luger's strategy changed, and he now sought to prove that neither his patent nor Browning's were valid, because toggle locks were already a thing. It wasn't until October of 1901 that the matter was decided by the Patent Office. It went to Browning's favor, but by this time the ship had sailed on his toggle-lock shotgun. VP of Winchester Bennett still wasn't a fan, and now it had become a legal quagmire. Even before the court battle was over, he returned Browning's prototype with a note that included, "I find that other people here have become afraid of the gun, and nothing that we do with it seems to fix it up." And it's true that John Moses' shotgun was a tricky device to get right. Various failures were too common, including accidental discharge from mechanical failures. There were also complaints that attempts to lubricate the gun just resulted in oil being tossed in the shooter's face as that toggle lock came back and forth. Browning was forced to come up with something entirely different, and boy did he. Finally, in October of 1900, he cooked up a long recoiling auto-loading tubular magazine shotgun using a vertical locking block and a charging lever set in the buttstock. This was interesting, but not really market ready. The trigger group, however, was sublime and would carry forward for quite a long time in a number of different firearms. A rifle variation of the same long recoil concept and using the same trigger group with a similar cocking arrangement seems to have been developed after the shotgun. However, this patent was filed first in June of 1900. Unlike the shotgun, however, this rifle used a rotating locking bolt. In concept, this is much closer to what would become a later product, but it wasn't quite there yet either. Finally, in March of 1901, this improved version of the shotgun uses roughly the same locking system. The elevator has been improved and designed to act as a loading safety. Charging, however, is accomplished by a lever set on the side of the breech block. This patent effectively locked down the very notion of a charging handle which pulls the breech out of lock, a huge concept that would frustrate Browning's competitors for some years to come. This design also features the first version of Browning's friction ring, which would resist the recoil force. Now, as usual, Winchester had actually helped to draft this patent application. They liked to assist Browning into covering as much as possible with his inventions, as they would inevitably be bought and then benefit Winchester in the market. Perhaps they became too comfortable with Browning's repeated help because, just like with the toggle shotgun, they were hesitant about his automatic. So they simply sat on the idea for a while. Maybe they thought he'd let it go because he had so many other projects. Well, he was still working at the machine gun problem, actually. Back in November of 1899, he had filed for a rapid belt loader, a design that at its core would remain in service through World War II. This was likely initially meant for his existing Colt 1895. And on that topic, here again was some controversy. Famed inventor Hiram Maxim had begun filing machine gun patents back in 1884. One portion of one of these contained the broad concept of using extra gas from the shot to work the action. Unfortunately for Maxim, there was no further development on this front, and he had chosen to focus on recoil instead. You can, of course, see where this led in our MG08 episode. Hiram Maxim went so far as to publish a brochure claiming Browning had stolen his gas operation method, though it seems he did not have a patent as such in the US, so he couldn't do much about Colt. By the time Maxim ever really dug into gas operation, the Colt 1895 was well into production though. Strangely enough, Browning now turned his attention from gas to recoil operation, ultimately beating Maxim at his own game. Filing in June of 1900, he had a whole new concept on paper. This boxy-looking beast hides a clockwork nightmare of various parts and operations. However, at its core is a simple vertical locking block, which will carry forward soon enough. Now, once more, John Moses wasn't working on one problem at a time. During all of this fray, he managed to get his Belgian pocket pistol into production and, with help from FN, adopted by the Belgian army. Now the Model 1900, this was a slightly bulked up and otherwise minorly improved version of the 1899. None of this work seems to have been done by Browning. A separate production line was run until the Belgian Army contract was completed. Then both the 1899 and the 1900s were updated into a unified pattern. You can learn all the details in our complete episode, no need to run them all down here. However, with the adoption of the 1900, people started to notice the handy pocket pistol, and sales ramped up rapidly. By 1914, nearly 725,000 would be sold, and the name Browning had become synonymous with an autoloading handgun. Turns out the unloved blowback was the first truly successful automatic pistol. Royalties from the successful Pistolet Browning likely spurred John Moses to start resenting Winchester and Colt for not tackling his best ideas. And of course, at this time, his favorite unrealized product was the autoloading shotgun. By this time, Winchester, under Bennett, had purchased some 30 patents that they never used, and yeah, they paid up front for each, on average $10,000 a pop, but when compared to hundreds of thousands in royalty payments from a realized product, that doesn't seem like much. And they also got the benefit of not allowing their competition to produce a gun that could sell so many units as to put their position in danger. Browning, however, would have benefited if these sold to the competitors. Letters indicate that around January of 1902, Bennett and Browning began to argue over who had truly invented a particular breech mechanism, which sadly isn't presently known to me. Apparently neither of them had filed patent on it just yet. Up until this point, by the way, Browning had gladly shown Bennett and his team his unpatented ideas. Now it seems that this was becoming risky. Thanks to the royalty play, Winchester was starting to hide its hand from John Moses and his brothers, and they were getting more covetous about, well, hold on, that's our feature, because we're no longer paying you a lump sum, we don't want to pay you forever on it. During all of this, of course, another patent was filed. This time it was the final version of what would become a famous autoloading shotgun, that flapping, vertically rising locking block set in the breech block itself, has finally reappeared on paper, filing in January of 1902. He also updated the friction rings into a now recognizable system. This patent, however, was filed later in June of 1904. That's even after it started production, so this must have been an afterthought. Taking his improved auto shotgun to Winchester, John Moses Browning knew they would just sit on the concept, so to force Bennett's hand, he demanded an outrageous payment and royalty agreement. From Bennett's perspective, the Diva had finally lost it. There was no market demand to match this expensive patent. Browning, however, felt that it could exceed his pocket pistol, meaning perhaps $1 million or more in royalty payments. Negotiations, of course, broke down and Browning walked away, taking all of his then-in-progress prototypes along with him. His departure was apparently startling for Winchester's investors and salesmen. Enough questions were asked that Bennett had to give an accounting to the Winchester family. A brief summary can be found in his statement. "We shall be perfectly able to get along without the Brownings, and shall probably be better off without them than with them. On the other hand, we do not believe they will get along as well without us as they did with us." Now I can say one thing for sure about Mr. Bennett. He was not clairvoyant. As for Browning and his auto shotgun, the commonly repeated story is that he took it straight to Remington Arms. Unfortunately, their head man, Marcellus Hartley, died of a heart attack just ahead of the scheduled meeting, so Browning hopped onto a boat that day to Belgium. That's probably not true, as Browning was well into a pattern of trying to market a gun simultaneously to FN for Europe and to various US companies for the US market. It's just likely that the mayhem of Hartley's death stalled any plans with Remington for a little while, so FN ended up with the first bite well ahead of time, and production of the new shotgun was begun in 1903. The result was the Auto 5 shotgun. This would see numerous minor updates over the next 70 years. In total, FN produced some 1.5 million copies. In 1905, a license was issued to Remington, eventually becoming the Model 11, which saw production over 1 million units. So that's over 2.5 million before we mention the various copies and derivations that exploded after the patent was finally dead. The Auto 5 was definitely a success. John Moses had been right again, and believe it or not, we'll come back to this same patent family in just a few minutes. For now, however, we have to pivot once more, as Browning still had a hand in the handgun market. Colt had been attempting to sell the government on his locked breech auto-loading pistol using a .38 caliber cartridge. Thanks to feedback, the takedown system was improved, and a last round slide hold open was fitted to the pistol, which also required modification of the magazine. This basic system, filed on in November of 1901, remains the standard for modern pistols today. The result was the Colt Model of 1902, a militarized version of the 1900, which continued Army trials. Unsurprisingly, we already have an episode on this firearm for your enjoyment and education. And on the topic of pistols, John Moses now took his full slide locked breech design and merged it with his blowback, while also sprinkling on some improvements. Filing in the US in April of 1902, this was the result, a shrouded hammer blowback pistol of fairly simple construction. That hid some rather nice features. Yes, it was easy to dismantle for cleaning, and it sports a grip safety, meaning you can't fire it without grabbing the grip. But unlike his previous designs, it also has a slide design such that it cannot exit the rear of the frame, not unless something big breaks. This was an update spurred by some failures of the simple cross blocks of the Colt pistols, or perhaps a backed out pair of screws from an FN 1900. Interestingly, this one patent would result in 2 firearms. In Europe, it was paired with the most powerful 9mm cartridge that they dared to use in a blowback gun, mind you. It was also scaled up to martial proportions. The resulting arm was eventually adopted by the Swedish Armed Forces, but you can learn more about that in our episode on the FN 1903. Back in the US, Colt used the patent to play catch-up to that Pocket 32 market, resulting in what they called the 1903 Pocket Hammerless. This pistol did in fact have a hammer, but it was hidden from sight. Fun fact, these would eventually serve alongside the FN 1900 during World War I. You can learn more about that in our episode on the Colt 1903. Now just don't get it confused with the Colt 1903 Pocket Hammer, which was barely pocketable and based on the Colt 1900 locked breech family. Just for good measure, we actually have an episode on that pistol as well. Honestly, it was dang close to being the first truly modern handgun in the commercial market. Now, our Browning's plate spinner wasn't done yet because he pivoted again back to the pump action shotgun. And this time I have to say he nailed an engineering home run. This tube-fed slide action sports an internal hammer and rocking breech lock which travels through the bolt. The shape is excellent as it prevents firing pin travel when out of lock and positively resets the pin during unlock. The lockwork itself is quite simple, as is the excellent and incredibly robust takedown system. Despite the 1903 patent filing and the 1905 approval, this new pump action wouldn't be produced until 1909. Licensed to J. Stevens Arms and Tool, this became their Model 520. With slight modification, it would remain in production until 1948, and a streamlined variation lasted until 1955. It's estimated just short of 200,000 of the original 520 were produced, and frankly, it's one of my favorites. And once again, while this is going on, John Moses was sneaking up on another amazing firearm. This time, it was an autoloading rifle. Back in March of 1901, he had filed an improvement on his long recoil rifle. At its heart, this is just the application of the charging handle to that earlier long recoil rifle design. There were, however, other minor improvements, but it wasn't quite all there yet. Now filing in December, he added a method for attaching the front sight to the barrel jacket. Much later though, in July of 1904, it was updated again. Here the lockwork was simplified. The bolt rotation is more rugged using a pin and cam system not unlike the Schmidt rifle. It also features a handy takedown lever and a broad safety lever set on the side of the frame. With the rifle unsafe, this serves as a dust cover for the action. Filing in August of 1905, we see the final piece in place, a simplified disassembly method for removing the charging handle and getting at the bolt. All this combined would be licensed to Remington and FN. In the US, it became the Remington Autoloading rifle, later renamed the Model 8. While an impressive feat of technology at the time, and an excellent North American game rifle, the 8 was something of a slow seller, just 80,000 units. Even so, it did see a fairly superficial update to become the Model 81 in 1936, therefore lasting into 1950, adding just shy of 56,000 more. FN didn't start production until 1910, marketing as the Carabine Browning. It confusingly came to be known as the Model 1900, so the same as the pistol that was actually from 1900. This was a really poor seller in Europe, with fewer than 5,000 produced. Both the Remington and the FN carbines did get a special episode from us, so you can learn more about them whenever you like. Now before we move on, I just want to point out that the Browning charging handle was a huge mess for Winchester. Just by example, they were forced to release their own autoloading rifle and shotgun because of market pressure. Both were a bit messy, with the infamous Model 1911 Widowmaker having to be cocked by working the barrel. And the Winchester 1907, one of a family of autoloaders in this configuration, relied on a press rod awkwardly stuck out the front of the forestock. They really should not have let that patent get away. Returning to Browning, however, in July of 1903, Rachel birthed their final child, Elizabeth Caroline Browning. That same year, the Brownings, along with Colt's patent firearms, sought injunction against Luger's pistol in the United States. The Germans had come to compete in the US pistol trials and were essentially the only real challenger on the field to Colt and Browning. Turnabout was apparently fair play to John Moses. Unfortunately, after 3 years of litigation, Luger's original second strategy actually worked out, and the toggle action improvement was declared invalid for want of invention. Colt and Browning were ordered to pay court costs. Luger's pistol ultimately washed out, not because the US didn't want it, but because DWM didn't want the expense of having to produce a bunch of trial samples in a government .45 caliber cartridge that was still under development when the German army was already paying them plenty of money to make pistols. Now the US cavalry was fed up with their .38 caliber revolvers and demanded that .45, and due to military experiences abroad, many army officers agreed. Small problem, that .45 was a real challenge for automatic pistols. Even the Colt 1902 struggled, developing broken links and cracks in the frame, just trying to get it up to a .41. So in May of 1905, Browning filed this patent covering a construction method that basically cloned the locking lugs into recoil brakes. Now the barrel made contact over several strengthened lugs with the frame. The result was the Colt 1905, a .45 caliber automatic pistol and the first in .45 ACP. Trialed with various little changes, this paved the way for what would become the US's first automatic pistol. It was also sold commercially, though with mixed success. Once again, you can learn more about this pistol and its trials variations in an episode we've already completed. Now Browning couldn't see the future, and I'll remind you again, there was plenty that he patented that went unproduced. This is just one of those, a rotating locked breech version of his Colt pistol, significantly reinforced for recoil. Oh, what could have been. And while we are still in the year 1905, this is when John Moses delivered a prototype vest pistol to the team at FN. By this time, he had learned a fair bit of the French language and was happily spending a good portion of each year in Liège, where the engineers were respectful and happy to have him on hand. Back in 1904, he had commissioned one William Morgan Thomas of the Union Metallic Cartridge Company to develop a tiny centerfire cartridge. This resulted in the diminutive 25 ACP. His US patent was filed much later, in June of 1909, however, a European set was sent out much earlier. Really, the core novel feature was a new grip safety system. The result was what we call the FN Model 1905 vest pistol, though some consider it the 1906 from its manufacture date. Over 400,000 would be sold. Another 420,000 or so would be produced at Colt's Patent Firearms, now their Model 1908, though effectively the same gun. From here we get two more oddities. The first is fairly impressive, but saw no production. In August of 1908, he filed for a simplified form of his Model 1886 lever gun lockup. Here, the link between the lever and the breech block has been transformed into a direct connection. It's possible this patent was meant to block improvements of the Winchester line. Returning to the topic of pump actions, be they rifle or shotgun, in December of 1906 he filed patent for this, a simple method of affixing the action bar to the grip itself. A combination of a key and screws to give strength while being of lower cost to produce. Now, so far for this episode, we've managed to trace Browning's path with his US patents, but for one gun in particular, there is no US coverage. Instead, the matter was covered in Belgium, France, and Europe. Filing in 1909, these French patents depict the final product, but only cover specific novel features, like a takedown method with an inset collar, changes to the safety's interaction with the slide, and the magazine catch, which was tweaked to prevent inertial release. We can also see the full slide, striker fire, and concentric recoil spring configuration. The final product is now known as FN's Model of 1910, though it was really launched during 1912. Available in .32 and .380 ACP, this became a very popular and reliable pocket pistol. Despite the FN 1900 being associated with anarchists and assassins, it was the FN 1910 that was in the hand of Gavrilo Princip that shot down Archduke Franz Ferdinand, leading to the outbreak of World War I. Yet again, this is a pistol we have sampled before, though in fairness that episode is a bit dated, so I'll put it on the list for an update. Post-war, the slide was extended with an add-on sleeve. This allowed for a longer barrel and led to several countries adopting the not-so-pocket pistol as standard. Back home, trials for what would become the United States' first self-loading service pistol were frankly spiraling. Colt and Browning's 1905 had been preferred amongst the available competition. Without Browning's help, Colt's Patent Firearms had been trying to tweak it into final acceptance. The hope, it seems, was to keep the existing tooling, especially because the 1905 had already entered commercial serial production. However, the specter of the Luger loomed over the trials. While DWM hadn't been willing to spend all the money to chase the 45 ACP Dragon, especially for a contract as small as the United States at that time, it was undeniable that the pistol's ergonomics, magazine release, safety position, and more were absolutely the best in the market. Ultimately, John Moses had to get involved again, this time inventing features that would bring Colt's pistol in line with the expectations set by the Luger. Filing in January of 1910, we see a very familiar looking handgun, and yet it isn't all there yet. We have a grip safety, slide release, forward bushing takedown system. It also borrowed the earlier concept of keeping the slide from ever traveling off the rear of the frame. All this and more resulted in the Colt model of 1910, which performed much better in US trials. It would only take a little tweaking to finally bring it into focus. Filing in April of 1913, after the pistol was already adopted and into production, we finally see the manual thumb safety, the detents for it and the takedown, the final version of the mainspring, and some grips that were actually never put into production. This, of course, was Colt's Patent Firearms Model of 1911, a famed handgun of the US services for 2 world wars. And of course, we do have several episodes covering the World War I era for these pistols. If you're curious about the details, come and give them a watch. I would just like to point out that just developing the 1911, let alone the very notion of the modern handgun, should be enough to make John Moses Browning an arms-making legend. But of course, we also saw he was responsible for the golden era of Winchester firearms, the dawn of machine guns in the US, and even the introduction of the automatic rifle and shotgun to the US commercial market. Any guesses if he's going to stop now? Not a chance, because during 1912, we see him hard at work on a delightfully tiny auto-loading carbine. Filing in November, we see a blowback small caliber buttstock loading design. The spent casings eject downwards. This also has a lovely takedown feature. Further refinements to that option were filed in March of 1913. Here, a detented sliding latch, which would release the halves for rotation and thereby disassembly. Also in March, we see changes to the trigger group to allow for a new cross-bolt manual safety. The resulting rifle is, frankly for me, a bit confusing. That's because I have not had the occasion to do a deep dive on the resulting automatic 22 that was licensed to FN. Period drawings and later examples of actual guns seem to have some discrepancies that can, as a whole, be found on several patents, so forgive me for not having all the details for this episode today. Filing in August of 1914, seemingly late given the war, but this was actually likely a delayed US filing, Browning improves the extractor and makes several adjustments to the lockwork to better function with 22 LR ammunition. Regardless of small details, Browning's .22 caliber automatic carbine began production at FN in 1914, though of course this was put on hold for some time given the outbreak of the First World War. Still, the arm returned later on, now under the Browning Arms name, selling around 500,000 units in total. Skipping well ahead but staying within this vein, the FN Auto 22 is often confused with the extremely similar Remington Model 24 and Model 241 carbines. These guns use the same core features as the FN built samples, but also include some later upgrades. The lockwork is more like what is shown now, Browning's filing from April of 1920, in which the extractor was improved to be more self-adjusting. There was also this July filing to make magazine feeding more positive, especially because of issues in cold weather. Over 130,000 Model 24s were produced up until 1935, when the slightly changed Model 241 entered production, lasting until 1951. This added another 107,000 or so to the pile. Strangely unseen is an accessory that John Moses patented way back with the first Auto 22 filing. Submitted in November of 1912 was this paper tube, which you could thumb shut at both ends, a way to store, transport, and rapidly load .22 long rifle, seemingly specifically designed for his automatic carbine. While the .22 carbine just snuck into production before all hell broke loose, one design of Browning's did not make it under the wire. Filing in November of 1913, this was another variation of the pump-action shotgun, a whole new lockwork, a tipping lock bolt, and a method of disassembly bordering on takedown. This patent was sold over to Remington but did not enter production before the outbreak of the Great War. During the delay, the action was revised by John Pedersen and G.H. Garrison, resulting in a sort of small commission shotgun. Remington released it exclusively in 20 gauge to avoid competing with their existing Model 10 12 gauge. The Remington 17 both loaded and ejected from the same underside port. It was robust, reliable, and much beloved by its users. But given its limited chambering, it didn't come to dominate the market, selling a moderate 72,000 or so units before production ended in 1941. In 1937, however, Ithaca Gun Company began producing their own clone in 12 gauge. This was, of course, immediately after the final patent ran out on the original Remington design. The 37 was extremely successful, staying in production until 2005, with sales over 2 million in total. Alright, we've mentioned the war a few times now, but let's talk about how it affected John Moses Browning. He had actually been in Belgium in the early half of 1914, only leaving in June, right about the time that Princip shot the Archduke with an FN 1910. By August, Liège was under attack from the Germans. Public comments from Browning showed his surprise that the network of Belgian fortifications had been defeated so quickly. Now the men and women he had known were at the mercy of the German army. Workers and managers were sent to factories in Germany. Browning's own friend, the general manager, was jailed for refusing to cooperate with keeping FN in production for the German war effort. Production was therefore halted for lack of support, though I'm unsure if machines were left or stolen back to Germany. I have a feeling they were taken home. The facility itself served as a vehicle repair depot and a hospital. On a more personal note, Browning's own nephew was in Belgium on a missionary trip when the invasion began, so he saw it firsthand, writing home with details. With FN shut down, the majority of Browning's commercial royalties vanished overnight, though some arms in the US would see very increased production. Author Nathan Gorenstein also suspects John Moses might have had a mistress in Liège, as he had prevented his son Val from staying in the same hotel as himself during their visits to Belgium. With all these worries, it's no wonder that he kept working hard at what he could do best for the war effort, providing arms to the Entente. Here things start to overlap once more. Finally, in March of 1917, we see a new shrouded hammer slide-operated .22 long rifle pistol. Licensed to Colt, this patent specifically trailed the beginning of production back in 1915. Initially called Colt's Target model, this would eventually become the now famous Woodsman .22 pistol. Produced with many variations until 1977, nearly 700,000 would be sold. This was, of course, at best a training option, but it was something he could sell that would actually enter production. Honestly, after the break with Winchester, Browning wasn't cranking out patents until his invention had some hope of sales. It's hard to say how many ideas he had in his head throughout the conflict. If you're wondering why a target pistol instead of, say, a machine gun, well, that's a matter for the U.S. Ordnance Department. Chief of Ordnance Brigadier General William Crozier wasn't in a hurry to stock up the United States Army. Some of this was his lack of foresight, but a lot of it was a complete unwillingness on the part of U.S. lawmakers to commit the funds that would be needed to expand the frankly tiny U.S. armed services, and of course their lack of equipment. Though I will say, with money finally in hand, he still dawdled a bit. This explains why there is a 2-year gap from the start of the Great War until we see Browning really moving on the question of fully automatics. Filing in October of 1916, this patent was held back to remain secret until after the war. The device covered was Browning's base improvement to his earlier recoil-operated machine gun. The vertical block is still there, of course, but so are a number of refinements which we thankfully have covered in detail before. Browning's mechanism became the most reliable heavy machine gun of the Great War, and it did so with relatively little weight, all while being half the cost of the competition. The result was the Browning Model of 1917, which frankly didn't see very much service. Arriving to the front later in 1918, it was expected to be used in the 1919 offensives, but the armistice interrupted this plan. John Moses even patented a tripod to go along with his gun. This adjustable setup was meant to get the most out of his machine gun in the trenches of the Great War. And to keep those belts topped up, he designed an improved loader. This was filed on September of 1919 after the war was over. I'm unsure how long before that he had the concept in hand. There was also a post-war patent of his for roughing the cartridges in just such a manner to keep them from wandering in their belts. I don't know if this was being employed though. Again, if you'd like to know more about this particular gun, we have a freestanding episode. Because of the short lead time and quick fielding of the Model 1917, a number of flaws, mostly the receiver's sort of rigidity and sight calculations, plus some opportunities for improvement, would be rolled into a new model very quickly. While not a direct product of John Browning, it was an evolution of his 1917. This model of 1919 serves even today, and has been adapted into a variety of improvements and role-specific modifications, seeing near worldwide service. Alright, that's a heavy machine gun down, but what about something more portable? Well, Browning had apparently brought his own idea to ordnance, something closer in concept to a submachine gun. They, however, wanted an automatic rifle in the service cartridge, something that could support an emerging trench-busting doctrine. This was walking fire, or taking a shot with every other step while crossing no man's land. The hope was to keep the enemy's heads down, suppressed with overwhelming firepower, while the riflemen advanced alongside of a smaller wave of hip-fire machine gunners. Well, thankfully, John and Ed Browning had worked up a novel locking breech that could be paired with a box magazine some 5 years earlier. Their hope at the time had been to put up something against the Bene Merci. That was the US version of the Hotchkiss 1909 as produced at Colt's. This had been a US Ordnance tactic of adopting an automatic rifle instead of a standard machine gun. It did not go as well as they had hoped. You can see much of this history and how the gun works in our episode on the Hotchkiss Portative. While the Bene Merci would prove to be so unwanted that the US refused to field it in the Great War, at the time Browning had considered an alternative, Ordnance wasn't interested, so he had left that project idle. With the Great War raging, however, the design was dusted back off and rapidly improved upon. The result was this, a box magazine select fire automatic rifle. That, while larger than any normal rifle, was still man-portable, and mostly shoulderable. The bolt locks with a sort of knee arching up into the receiver. Operating power is provided by a gas piston. The result, the Browning automatic rifle of 1918. Happily, you can learn all about this fantastic creation in our dedicated video. Despite being so useful, the BAR was also a last-minute addition to the Great War. Even more so than the 1917. Army leadership felt they didn't want to reveal it to the enemy until the spring of 1919, where its surprise addition would help break the German lines. So production was actually geared towards rearming in the winter, and Colt's patent firearms still struggled to keep up. Ordnance actually forced Colt to allow other manufacturers to use the patent. Now a myriad of factories were tooling up to produce Browning's machine guns, both the BAR and 1917, or parts thereof. John, Matt, and Ed all moved to New England to help with the effort, traveling between Colt, Remington, Westinghouse, and even Winchester. Reunited with his old partner business, John Moses happily inquired about his old friends. Son Val Browning left his education at Cornell and accepted a commission as a lieutenant in the Ordnance Corps. There he trained instructors, who then trained the machine gun teams on his father's weapons. Val was also attached to 79th Infantry, the first to be equipped with the Browning MGs on the front line. I don't believe, however, he served in the active trenches. And just to review, the US was now using Browning designs for their sidearm, their trench shotgun, though the 97 had a bit of Mason added on, their walking fire auto rifle, and their heavy machine gun. The Belgian army, by the way, was using the FN 1900 as their official sidearm, and when FN went out of production, they bought up Colt 1903s on contract, another Browning pistol. So just to review, early war, Browning's European royalties dry up completely. There are some sales of his products in the US or from the US to foreign powers. These grow over time. Then government contracts for his two new MGs entitle John Moses to at least $5 million by October of 1917. If the spring offensive of 1919 had actually been undertaken, this might have doubled. But at this time, the US government was doing something the modern American cannot fathom. They were trying to limit spending taxpayers' money. In a meeting with John Moses and brother Matt, the Ordnance Department requested that they accept a maximum of $1.5 million for both machine guns. Matt recalls that he expected his brother to ask for some time to think it over, maybe give a counteroffer. But John Moses apparently just said, "If that suits Uncle Sam, it's all right with me." Unfortunately, despite his patriotic spirit, Browning soon learned to never trust the government. At the same time that he was paid his $1.5 million, that government levied a special income tax to pay for the war effort. And of course, they taxed his negotiated payout, leaving him with just $600,000 on an over $5 million owed. An FN executive recalling the story later on said, "John almost died from it." Even so, he kept hard at work. By the time the war ended, he was already adapting his 1917 machine gun for an anti-materiel role. Towards the end of the war, armor was becoming more prevalent, both on the ground and in the air. The French and Germans had both invested in big bore cartridges, though it wouldn't be until right at the end of the war that the US learned of the 13.2mm German anti-tank cartridge and its matching bolt-action rifle. Yep, we have a whole video on that one as well. Instead, the US first encountered the French 11mm Gras Plus P+, a cartridge developed for air-to-air use, as they could make an effective incendiary to use against balloons. General Pershing pursued the matter with vigor, working with Winchester, Browning, and others to develop what would later become the American .50 caliber cartridge. At the same time, Browning was working on a modification of his 1917 to accept the massive round. But of course, the armistice brought this project to a, well, not stop, but a crawl. It will be a little while before we hear of it again. The frantic war years may have had a further effect on John Moses Browning, now in his early 60s, because through various personal remembrances, it seems that post-war, he never did return to normal. That is to say, he was now fully consumed by his work. Previously, Browning had been involved in a number of community shooting clubs, annual camping and hunting trips. He really loved the beautiful and unspoiled West. There are many stories about him hunting in the wilds and enjoying his fellow citizens of Ogden, Utah, be they wealthy or poor. Now, however, he was a man possessed, even remarking that he wished he had gotten to real work much sooner in life. Wife Rachel actually recalls taking him to a play to get him out of the shop, but found him failing to applaud at the end because he had no idea what was going on, as his mind had already wandered back to work. So, post-war, once again, John Moses Browning dove into overlapping series of firearms projects. Happily, he reached back out to his favorite facility, Fabrique Nationale in Belgium. Unfortunately, however, the war had been very rough for them. The factory needed rebuilt, names and faces had changed somewhat, and their focus was purely on utility now. This must have been a disappointment to Browning, who had an idea for a new sporting shotgun, something of a luxury turned middle-income feature. FN, however, wasn't interested. The broad availability of military surplus also hampered any endeavors on their part to secure new large contracts that might prepay for equipment, so better to keep it simple. Finally, in July of 1919, Browning whipped up a pump-action .22 caliber rifle. With its tube magazine, flipping elevator, and linear bolt, it's not unlike the old Winchester 1893 in some ways. This is something FN could handle and would produce all the way to 1974 with 150,000 or so sold. It is most commonly called the trombone by collectors, and it was never produced in the US, with imports being uncommon as well. With FN dragging feet, he likely turned back to the US market, which was also suffering from post-war shock. Many arms producers had loaded up on debt to build massive facilities for essentially limitless contracts that were then suddenly dropped. With very little additional payment. Nearly all of them had become insolvent or at the very least dangerously close to it. So while John Moses Browning threw out ideas, not everyone stuck. Perhaps because of contacting Winchester once more, he filed in May of 1920 on an improvement for the Browning family of lever-action rifles. This time it was a means to feed varied lengths of cartridges, likely hoping to let people choose between regular and mini shells before that was a thing. In May of 1922, another commercial option for a type of tangent rear sight that might be fitted to a slide-operated pistol, say the Colt Woodsman. Flipping back to military concerns though, automatics were all the rage. Now, as I said earlier, during the war, Browning had offered up something that loosely sounded like a submachine gun, a .32 caliber 100-round magazine automatic that would spray bullets like water from a garden hose. U.S. Ordnance, however, wasn't interested at the time. This April 1921 filing is the only document I know that could possibly be related to the supposed earlier offer by John Moses. It depicts a clearly military-stocked autoloading rifle, complete with detachable magazine, clearly chambering cartridges that are much smaller than the standard .30-06. The bolt travels at an angle sliding down the wrist, a feature found in some much later submachine guns attempting to mitigate recoil. Following up in September, he's made some changes to improve feeding from the magazine. Writing to FN about this carbine, Browning stated, "This class of gun, I am satisfied, is the coming military arm." You know, a sort of intermediary caliber, lightweight, 33-round, fully automatic infantry rifle. That'll never catch on. John Moses also spent some time overhauling and improving his Browning automatic rifle of 1918. However, that project wouldn't come to fruition for some time, so we'll just put a pin in it for now. More successful was his work on that .50 caliber anti-materiel machine gun. Wartime samples had worked fine, but the recoil made them all but unusable in the field. Letters indicate that he had a buffer system figured out by the middle of 1920. However, we only get to see it in patent in July of 1923. This represents the first of a long line of US .50 caliber machine guns, adapted right at the start for either water jacket ground use or naked remote fire in the air. Both versions saw adoption but scant service as the model's 1921, which only really came about in 1923. The .50 cal would continue to evolve, and so we see a series of patents covering various accessories and features. In September of 23, we see he is still working on a buffer system, in this case making it more compact by changing the angle to vertical. In November, a large drum feed system, which actually wasn't granted until 1931. In March of 1924, a filing for a remote fire and synchronization system for aircraft use. Another variation followed in July. And in September, we see a sear and sync meant to work with an electrical interrupter. Other accessories include this omnidirectional feed plate for aviation, a Lewis gun style overhead pan magazine feed, and this ammunition box belt fed system for Browning machine guns filed in January of 1926. All of these, by the way, could in theory be applicable to the .50 or .30 caliber guns with minor adjustment. On the personal front, John Moses Browning's life wasn't always uncomplicated. Yes, he was a busy and industrious man, but there was also the same smattering of family scandal you'd expect given so many children, nephews, nieces, and others spreading out into the world. In 1923, an ongoing family dispute finally boiled over. His daughter Elsie, born in 1890, I remind you, had married a man named Benjamin Ballantine in 1913. Ben wasn't apparently a good husband. He expected the wealthy family to keep him happily funded, perhaps with a cushy and easy job for himself from his father-in-law. When this didn't come true, he lashed out at his wife, as well as the rest of the Browning family, and tended to drink to excess. Eventually, Elsie began divorce proceedings, but Ben wanted a cash payment to leave. In 1923, Elsie's eldest brother, Jack Browning, went to visit Ben Ballantine and Elsie at their home in Salt Lake City. He brought along the family attorney and his cousin, Mariner Browning. That would be Matt's son, who was especially close to Elsie because of their similar age. The hope was to get her to come back to the family home in Ogden. They found her husband Ben drunk and at first remorseful, but when they tried taking dear sister out of the situation, he flew into a rage. Accounts say that he fetched a revolver and brought it to bear at Jack. Mariner pulled a pistol of his own and shot Ben in the neck. He died at the hospital with a deathbed statement that he was an unarmed victim and had been attacked by the Browning brothers. Widow Elsie refused to attend her husband's funeral and had to go to court to testify in defense of her brother and cousin, as both Jack and Mariner were charged. In the lead up to the trial, during a visit with his attorney, Matthew Browning, the business mind of the Browning family and father of Mariner, collapsed from a heart attack and died. John Moses Browning tried to be present during the court proceedings. However, he was driven away by a flurry of reporters driving for a scandal. All the same, in December of 1923, both the younger Brownings were found not guilty of murder. The act had been in self-defense. Even so, it was another blow to John Moses, who returned to work a changed man. The financial leader of their little empire was now gone, let alone his longest-standing friend and close brother. His child's life had been threatened, and of course, he was still yet older with so much more work to do. Now, throughout all of this, John Moses was still working on his .50 caliber machine gun, plus upgrades to that BAR, and even a 37mm autocannon. I'd introduce them all now, but given the time taken to resolve them into a solid invention, we'll address each as they solidify. Turning back to Liège, John Moses was starting to get some guff from his friends at Fabrique Nationale. Son Val was spending most of his time serving as Browning's Belgian liaison, but he wasn't given the same respect as his father, nor, according to the FN team, did he deserve it. Most engineers and management found John Moses Browning to be a humble, almost shy man, quiet, calm, and polite, though his poker-like expression could sometimes unnerve them. He was known to tolerate even the strangest or most annoying personality traits in his fellows, so long as they had some skill or knowledge worth sharing with him. As for son Val, they felt he was too hot-headed and demanding of their company, let alone being inconsistent. It is true, by the way, that he had to on occasion apologize for his various threats. Regardless of Val, John Moses was still pressing FN on the topic of an over-under shotgun, but they didn't believe the market was all that ripe for such a luxury. Instead, they wanted him to focus on a pistol design for the upcoming French trials, not to mention any other nations that might think of modernizing their sidearms, which was an underdeveloped market. They had, all the way back in 1920, pressured him to work on a new design with a double-stack magazine. His response in 1921 included 15 cartridges in the magazine, especially such cartridges as the 9mm Luger, is almost an impossibility. The man wasn't perfect, and here's your proof. FN engineer and assistant to John Moses, Dieudonné Savet, took the time to convert an FN 1903 into a double-stack configuration. The sample was sent to Ogden for Browning's inspection. This apparently had the desired effect. It's actually hard to say when John Moses had which idea, but in June of 1923, he was ready once more to file a patent. This covers a slide-operated pistol. Note that the slide is recessed into the frame like the later Petter pistols. Room is provided for a tangent rear sight. The action is short recoil locking with a tipping barrel and overhead barrel lugs, though that tipping action comes from a solid cam and pin this time. The gun is also striker fired. Prototypes developed from this patent were very successful in French trials, but despite their request for the capacity and other features, the French ultimately decided it was too big, and they went in an entirely different direction. Thanks. FN, however, felt the concept was a winner and kept Sae working on the design. The project itself would morph into the now ever popular High Power, a pistol I'm actually hesitant to declare a Browning design. Certainly the High Power is largely made up of former Browning patents, but the choice of combination and the finishing touches were never his. Its defining feature is actually its capacity, something he frankly scoffed at until Sae showed it to him. What John Moses Browning did do most of the work on was a series of upgrades to the original BAR that I keep hinting at. The first filing was in January of 1922. Here we have an improved system for retaining the box magazines, simpler and more robust. Later that same month, he filed on a dust cover system to prevent the automatic rifle from fouling from the elements. Here, the dust cover essentially puts the rifle on safe so as to prevent any error. This can almost be considered an expansion of his idea for that safety cover paddle that was fitted on the Remington Model 8. Filing in January of 1923, the dust cover safety was further improved and simplified. In September of 1923, we see him file this, a more significant change in that it adds a whole new assembly. Now a gear system is fitted to adjust the rate of fire, slowing the automatic rifle down to a more controllable pace. In May of 1924, he filed patent on a concept to further seal up the rifle, now in the instances where the magazine was removed from the action. A cover flap is provided to make sure the gun is kept clean. These features, and actually somewhat varied combinations, would be used to improve the BAR over several models. The result in the US was Colt's R75, the first model to be called the Monitor, though the R80 is far more commonly encountered today. Sadly, it lacks some of the features from the Browning patents. FN would eventually produce their own version, which over time became the Model D, with extra changes made by Sae. This model, however, does include more of the Browning patents. Seemingly unused was a May 1924 filed patent for an over-barrel bipod arrangement. Every production model I know of was mounted with the bipod underneath. Alright, as you can kind of tell, we're running up and down the early 1920s over and over. That's because John Moses Browning was a very busy and inventive man, trying to pin down several branches of his art all at the same time. Sadly, however, an end must come to all good things. Before that, though, the US Army asked the machine gun maestro to take a look at making something a bit bigger still, a 37mm automatic cannon. Filing in December of 1923, then just a week after his son and nephew were found not guilty of murder, John Moses Browning laid down a monstrous machine gun. To be honest with you, I'm not an expert in ordnance on this scale, so I'll leave the details for another day. Filing in April of 1924, we get a refinement of the previous gun, with a strong focus on improving feeding and extraction. In January of 1925, patent was filed for a cartridge feed mechanism, a sort of mega feed strip. In October of 1925, a filing was made for an improvement for the cooling jacket attached to the big gun. This represents the last change on paper made to this system by John Moses Browning. His autocannon wouldn't be adopted until 1942 during the Second World War. It became the M4 and with some modifications and disintegrating links, the M10. These were used on some aircraft like the P-39 Airacobra, but they were more commonly found on PT boats. Apparently, overall, they were a bit short on muzzle velocity, resulting in difficulties with actually striking the target. Now, we finally get to John Moses' passion project, the over-under shotgun, which he had begun as early as 1920, but without encouragement had stalled here and there, resulting in the first filing for patent coming in October of 1923. While over-under barrel arrangements had existed since the percussion era, they were uncommon at best, and up to this date a luxury available only to the wealthy, who bought them as a custom long gun. Browning's notion was to make an affordable but still quality alternative. Here we see an over-under, which cocks the action when open, and operates with a single trigger. Novel was his development of a means to keep the strain of firing off of the hinge on which the gun breaks open. This would greatly aid in the longevity of the piece. He also provides a takedown method where the fore-end need not be a third piece, avoiding its damage or loss. Filing in September of 1924, he improved the fore-end fitment to the barrel. He refined the lockwork, including a means to fire each barrel selectively and in a chosen order, and fitted a selective extractor that would not eject unfired shells. And filed by the Browning estate in February 1928 after his death, is a patent that further refines the selective extraction feature, though there are some other minor improvements listed. This, in all likelihood, is as far as the shotgun made it during his lifetime. Letters from his son Val show that John Moses Browning was in Liège in winter of 1925, and while Val describes him as doing quite well, his level of detail about his father's habits as communicated back home seems to suggest that there was some worry. John Moses went home to Ogden in June of 1926, but would return to Liège later that year, and for the first time in his life, he actually brought along his wife Rachel. This change of habit could have been benign, but again, it might suggest that his age was catching up with him. He and his wife spent Thanksgiving with Val and his family. The next day, the Browning men drove to the FN factory, with John Moses stopping in Val's office and then heading to the manufacturing floor. He returned just a few moments later, displaying signs of cardiac distress, and attempted to walk off the pain, but then laid down to await the doctor, who on arrival administered stimulants. According to Val, John Moses spoke to him. "Son, I wouldn't be surprised if I am dying," and shortly thereafter expired. I honestly don't think that John Moses Browning would be embarrassed much to have died in his suit in the offices of Fabrique Nationale, still pursuing his work. Now, of course, we know this wasn't the end of his inventions. Many of those already made would become century-long classics, but even those yet not produced, like the FN Model D, the M4 autocannon, arguably elements that form the FN high-power pistol, would carry on into production. His final and most cherished project, the over-under shotgun, would also move forward. With Val finishing up the work, the Browning Superposed entered production in 1931, finally delivering the clean sighting and excellent balance of an over-under plus Browning reliability to the masses. Produced into the 1970s with only minor changes, it really only left production due to financial forces pushing manufacture to move to Japan. Now, that will do it for all of his firearms, at least as I know them. However, there is one more supposed John Moses Browning patent. I say it that way because this was filed by the estate in June of 1929. Curiously, it depicts a modification of the 1893 Borchardt toggle lock, including the old-style brake at the rear. The novelty lies in the fact that the toggle joint no longer bears any force as a breech block. Instead, a lug is swung to join the breech to the presumably receiver or other frame. Frankly, I have no idea for what application this was considered. The patent does not depict a whole firearm, and I know of none that use this take on a lockwork. Why it was filed later on, I still do not know. Alright, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is about as brief of an overview as I can make out of the patents and firearms that spawned from the mind of John Moses Browning, complete with a gentle sprinkling of biographical data for you to figure out where we are in the story. Now, if you like this mad dash, I highly encourage you to read the much more personal story of his life as presented by Nathan Gorenstein in his book, The Guns of John Moses Browning. While I've done more patent digging, his work has much more detail on the man's upbringing, business endeavors, and personal life. It's not terribly expensive, and it's available right now. Now, just to be clear, I have never been paid to promote this book, I just happen to enjoy it. We have, however, received executive producer support along with some peer review from the House of Browning, one man's project and thankfully public website that seeks to further catalog the achievements we've only skimmed over in today's lesson. If you're still curious about John Moses or some facet of his patents or inventions, I do recommend checking it out. But if you'd like to thank us, if you'd like to enjoy this content more, make sure to help us stay funded over at Patreon or Player. All right, y'all. Have a good one.
But he seems to have capped the population of gnats, and in fact, he has reduced them to 0.
Okay.
So he did a great job with that. So we came to an agreement that as long as he doesn't get bigger and, like I said, crawl above me, he can stay rent-free. I'm not going to bother with it.
So what did he do?
He's done that. He hasn't gotten any bigger.
No, that you were going to get in a fight. You said you were going to get in a fight with him.
Yeah, I told you. I literally said it like a minute ago. He
crawled above.
He did crawl above me.
Okay.
And then we had a fight.
What does that mean, though? Had a fight? What did you do?
I yelled at him.
No, just because it's online now doesn't mean it always will be. I know that a lot of this actually is because of the failures of the Gazette d'Armes. That's really making me mad.
Yeah.
Gazette d'Armes was all available online. You could search the whole thing.
I remember.
It was that site 1001 Mags, and it just disappeared overnight because they had frauded some of their magazine suppliers. And they just packed up and disappeared.
and now none of it's available. And I'm not even talking about like trying to provide a political divide or anything like that. I mean just the basic interactivity being so bad that it's like trying to have a conversation with another. Imagine if you went into the dentist and they lock your mouth open and they're poking around in there, and then they just put a guy next to you with his mouth locked open, and they're like, "Yeah, you guys should talk," because that's what it's like to use Twitter right now. You know what I mean?
Well, it's also weird that the dentist does ask you questions that you're then supposed to respond to while your mouth is wide open.
Like just trying desperately to talk to another human being in a way that makes any sense when you're all preloaded with anxiety from this stupid crap.
Now, on the serrations, you may have noticed, if you're very eagle-eyed, that there's fewer over here. They removed one step, but kept the same length in order to get a more rapid escalation to the outside, and therefore allow for a slightly better and more aggressive grip on this particular